and business actions and decisions are made. So that's the picture of Corinth. But if you look at it, everywhere else around that forum area is very well organised. It's called a centuriation pattern. It's kind of like an ancient game of SimCity, where you've got everything nicely divided up into a grid and you just plot buildings along those streets. So everything around the city centre is very well organised. But in the middle, it's a little bit off-centre. And the reason for that is because the foundations of all of the forum and all of these main buildings were still there. So why build it again? Why start with new foundations? Let's use the existing foundations, but everything else around it, we follow according to a Roman pattern. Now, this is important for us because what it means is that Rome, or the city of Corinth, is a Greek city with a Roman facade. What the Romans had done was to come along and to put their own Roman touch on it, but there was still a lot of evidence of the original Greek city. One of the places that we see that is here in the Fountain of Pirene. Now, if you look at that fountain there, it's very standard first century Augustinian architecture with the arches, all of that. That is as just Roman as they come. You see those arches, you know that's Rome. But when you look closely behind the arches, the original fountain, the original Greek fountain, is still there. And so what they've done is they've simply built the Roman facade over the existing Greek fountain. And you say, what is Greek culture? What is this, mixture of architecture got to do with the culture? Well, as we're going to see in a moment, it gives you a sense of a dual identity. It means that you're certainly part of a Roman city, a Roman colony specifically, but there's still so much of this original Greek that the Romans hadn't destroyed, that to be a Corinthian means that you're both Roman and Greek at the same time. And that's important both in how you identify and understand yourself, but also in some of the practices that we're going to see momentarily. But one of the really important elements of Corinth, one of the things that made Corinth so famous, other than being a trade-driven city that we saw, was what we call the Isthmian Games. Now, within the ancient Greek world, there were four main games. There was the Olympic Games that we still have today. There were the Nemean Games. There were the Nemean Games. I always forget this one, the Isthmian Games, and the fourth one is going to come to me, but we'll get there. The Isthmian Games were held a few kilometres away from the city of Corinth, and they were part of the four major games that took place in the Greek calendar. So these were the main event. This is kind of like the Soccer World Cup, and you imagine today you've got the Olympics, you've got the Soccer World Cup, and maybe a tennis open or something like that. You've got these major international events. Well, this was one of the top four events in the Greek and Roman world. So the Isthmian Games, held every 2 years, were close to Corinth. What that meant was that Corinth was the host of the Isthmian Games. So if you were to visit the Isthmian Games, you were coming to Corinth. And if you wanted to know how the Isthmian Games were happening, well, then you've got to look to Corinth, because Corinth was the city that hosted it. So every 2 years, there would be this major international set of games that took place just up the road from Corinth that was run and effectively ministered by the Corinthians. In fact, specifically, it was paid for by one person. Every 2 years, somebody they would go into an election and you would vote for whoever it was that was going to pay for the games. And you think, well, that just sounds like you draw the short straw. No. Quite the opposite. To pay for the games, well, one, you had to be extremely wealthy. Could you imagine one single person today paying for the entire Soccer World Cup? Just incredible. That's incredible amounts of money. But if you have that sort of money, to be able to lay claim to the fact that you paid for the entirety of the games is a huge deal. And so people would be falling over themselves to get the honour of hosting these games. So every 2 years, this would be the event that would happen. And some of the events I've written it right there. The Pythian Games. If I just look at my notes, it's going to make a lot more sense. These are held between April and May. And some of the key events are these: the foot races, boxing, as you would imagine, wrestling, the Pancration, which is kind of like a mixture of wrestling and boxing, kind of like a modern MMA. Basically, in all of the ancient fights, there's only two things you can't do: eye gouge and hit somebody in the genitals. And everything else is up for grabs. If you were boxing, what you would do is you would, instead of having like padded boxing gloves like we do today, you'd actually wrap your hands in leather. The idea was it will protect your knuckles, but it will also do more damage when you punch the opponent. So really brutal. The idea was just a very bloody event. So you've got those, you've got the pentathlon, which is sort of the 10 games, or the 10 events all together. You'd have the horse races, you'd have music, and interestingly, you'd have oratory. Now, could you imagine today if public speaking was an Olympic event? It would just seem strange. Go back to the first century, very normal, very important event, which becomes important later on. Now, if you won the games, not just the event, but if you were the ultimate winner of the games, what you would win was a crown of dried celery. And you go, all that effort for a piece of grass. I mean, it's kind of like if you won a gold medal at the Olympics today and you realise it's just gold foil with chocolate inside. Like, you could literally eat the thing. And you go, so what the hell's the point? Well, the point is the honour that comes along with having won the games. And if you see this sort of statue that you've got here in the picture, that's the idea of it, that you would always have the honour of having won the games. Interestingly, Paul uses this as a metaphor. He says, don't run for a prize that perishes. What's he talking about? The crown of celery that all of the Corinthians would be familiar with based on the knowledge of the Isthmian Games. So just very quickly, a couple of some of the interesting archaeological finds that they've got. You'll see this round thing here. You'd recognise that straight away as a discus because the discus was one of the ancient events. This is an interesting one. There are a set of weights. You would have one in each hand, and what this was actually the long jump. Rather than just run and just jump with your own strength, you would have these two weights in either hand that you would throw out in front of you that would give you extra sort of leverage, extra pull in the long jump. And there's a lot of pictures of those being used. Here we've got the original, or not the original, but that's where the starters track would have been. These timber posts are kind of like cricket stumps. If you imagine there was a peace line on top of it, and all of them were controlled. If you can see closely here, there's little tracks that are running along that stone there. What would be a starter who would stand there with all of these little strings and all of them attached to these bales, I guess, for want of a better term, on top of these posts. And he'd pull the strings, they'd all drop, and the runners would go on their way. So the Isthmian Games were an extremely important event that happened every 2 years in Corinth. And what's so significant about them is that in the year that Paul arrived, historians have calculated that there was probably an Isthmian Games event taking place. So Paul, being a tent maker, coming to a city that's just been inundated with people. Now, there's no hotels, of course, back in the ancient world. What you've got are tents. What you've got are, demountable dwellings. And so for Paul to come during the Isthmian Games is a very timely, both financially in that his trade is very useful there, but secondly, there's people from all over the world coming to watch these games. So very strategic, and the Isthmian Games, one of the many features that brings a particular honour to being a Corinthian citizen. But I've talked enough about that. We'll come back to that in future videos. But join me for the next one. Hey there and welcome back. So we're continuing in our discussion of the context of Corinth. Remember what I said, that it's very important for us to understand something of what we can at least know about Corinth, because that helps us to understand what it means to be a Corinthian. And really with that, it means that we can understand why the Corinthians did some of the things that they did. It wasn't that they were particularly sinful Christians, it's just that they were Corinthians being Corinthians. But anyway, so I said earlier on that Corinth was a market-driven city. It was a city of trade. And there's a very good geographical reason for that, and that is to do with the location of Corinth within the Greek or the Achaean region. If you look at the map there, you've got this very narrow little neck called the Isthmus, which is where we get the Isthmian Games from. It was on that isthmus that you see there. What used to happen, now Greece, if you look at your map there, Greece is sort of around the middle of the Mediterranean. And what used to happen was that ships that were sailing from east to west, particularly from Rome over to Ephesus, rather than sailing south all the way around that Peloponnesian area, would actually come into Corinth, get out the ship would be picked up, carried across, and then put into the water on the other side of that isthmus. And the reason for that's quite simple. The water around that area is quite treacherous, and it's about a 6-day journey. Whereas if you can come into Corinth, it's going to take you just as long. It's going to take you quite a while to get across, but it's much safer. So what that means is that every single day, people are coming in and going out of Corinth on a regular basis. They're coming in and they're always going to be traders and merchants and whoever else that might be that's out there in the water. And the thing about the Roman Empire is that it was very well connected by sea lanes. There were ships running up and down through the Mediterranean all the time. And so all of that business, all of that trade is coming through Corinth. So imagine a port city. Imagine a city that has the need for all of the resources and all of the supplies and all of the things that go along with running a dock. That in itself creates many, many employment opportunities. Then you need people that are going to supply the ships, and you're going to need sailors are going to be off the boat for a couple of weeks, and they're going to need to be entertained or have places to stay or things to do while they're there. And so there's a lot of opportunity for people coming in and out of the city. What that also means is people are coming in from all parts of the world, bringing different ideas and different values and different religions and whatever else you may have. So it's a really strategic location for Paul that we're going to see in a moment. Now the question you might be asking is, how did that happen? Well, this is a picture I took with standing on top of the Acrocorinth. So if you remember in the previous video, you've got this massive mountain right in the middle of Corinth. That's the Acrocorinth. And when you stand on top of it, if you can see there, you've got the two ports on either side, very close together. There's only about a 6-kilometre gap on either side of there. And that was where the ships used to come in and out on both sides. And what they used to run it along was this road that they've dug up called the Dialkos Road. You can see there, you can see the pathway that's running through that. That was the road that they used to use. How they did it, there's videos on YouTube that you can look up that give you an idea of maybe how that worked. It's all very much a bit of speculation. Now the question, of course, you ask is, why not build a canal? Well, for a start, they didn't have the machinery that we have today, but they certainly gave it a really good try. Nero was one of the more famous attempts Vespasian actually sort of coming after around 70 AD. Once the Jews had been destroyed, or once Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans, many of those Jews were brought back and they were used to attempt to build this canal. Now, of course, it didn't work because it was just too big a task to do. They didn't accomplish it until about the 19th century. And so you can see here the modern day canal. Now what's really disappointing is that they've finished building this canal, and it was great for its time. It was a perfect sized canal and everything was wonderful about it. But at about the same time as they finished it, the size of cargo ships and transport ships increased greatly. So much so that no ships can actually fit through there. So they built this fantastic canal, which is really, you get some yachts through there or some smaller ships, and that's about it. So it's, a bit of an unfortunate thing there. But nevertheless, so they have a canal, but that's a more a modern addition to the area. But looking at the city itself, now one of the things I keep stressing is that this is a Roman colony. It's formerly a Greek city that's now a Roman colony, which means that it's loyal to Rome and it's built on Roman structure. The architecture is Roman, and also the government system is very Roman. And so what you have, like any Roman city, is the citizen body. Above that you have the city council, which is the elected elites, and they're always the elites of the city that get those positions. And then every year out of those you elect to what are called duoviri, which are essentially like consuls in Rome. They're the two rulers of the city for that particular year. So very much a Roman structure, like we would find in Rome and any other throughout the Roman Empire. But the people of itself are what make it so interesting. If you remember, we talked about Caesar refounding the city. When he refounded it, there wasn't a city there. There were no people. There might have been some hermits there. There might have been some people that are just, living there because there's something there, I don't know. Whatever the case was, there was nothing to speak of to make it a city. And of course, to make a city, you need people. So where are you going to get these people from? Who are the people that need to come? Because whoever comes to that city are the ones that are going to have to build it. They're the ones that are going to have to do all the work to establish a city. And so at that point, you've got people that are looking for new opportunities. People that are living in big cities that are not getting, they don't have the space, they don't have the opportunities that they might get in Rome or in Athens or in the surrounding areas. But a new city, endorsed by Rome, essentially established by Rome, brings with it lots of new opportunities. So if you're entrepreneurial, if you've got a bit of a go-get-em sort of attitude, a bit of an adventurous spirit, this is a great opportunity. You can maybe achieve things in this new city of Corinth that you couldn't do anywhere else in the world. And so what starts to happen is that people from all different walks of life all come into this city at the same time and build this new city. Different types of people that you might find, so largely Greek freedmen. What I mean by a freedman is somebody who was formerly a slave who's now free, who's looking for, they're no longer a slave, they're looking to establish for themselves a new life. A lot of the time, or some of the time, what would happen would be that these slaves had learned some skills, developed for themselves some abilities, so that when they did get their freedom, they could become quite prosperous. They put into a place like Corinth, they could really excel. And so in Corinth, a brand new city, you can get those opportunities that you may not get in Athens or in Rome or in these places. And so you get a lot of Greek freedmen, people that have become successful in the Roman world and are now moving into Corinth, seeing the advantages that brings with it. So on the one hand, they're very Roman in that they've been living with slaves to a Roman family, but they're still very Greek in the fact that they're Greek, and they hold on to their Greek heritage. And so they've kind of got this dual identity. People with some wealth, some ability, with some opportunity, with both of these worlds together, both Latin and Greek, they become some of your early founders. But you also get some very Hellenized Roman families. So families who are very Roman, very traditionally Roman, but have also adopted a lot of Greek ideas, adopted a lot of the Greek worldview. And so to be able to move into a city like Corinth, which is both Roman and Greek at the same time, is ideal because they can indulge their Greek identity as well as still maintaining their traditional Roman identity. So you've got Greeks who are very Roman and Romans who are very Greek coming into Corinth, a city that is a Greek city that's been refounded as a Roman city. And so both of these worlds are being maintained and continued and sustained in this new city. So what that means is you've got a city that right from the get-go is bilingual. You go to Rome, it's Latin, and there's lots of other different languages, but primarily it's Latin. Go to Athens, it's Greek. You might have some people that speak Latin, but the language is Greek. In Corinth, it's both. In the public sphere, you speak Latin. In the private sphere, you speak Greek. And both of those worldviews, both of those cultures that are expressed in those languages are found in equal measure in these different contexts within Corinth. And so really what Corinth becomes is a bridge between the Greek and the Roman world. To the west of Corinth is Rome, to the east of Corinth is the Greek world. And so both of these worlds are kind of bridged in Corinth, in a city where people are coming from both sides all the time, coming through this city. You can be both Roman and Greek. This city can adapt to both. So this is a really important city for Romans, particularly, because for them, it's a city that is facing the Greek East. It's Roman in its establishment, it's Roman in its early influence, but to the Greeks, it's a city that they can come and be a part of and come and adapt to, but still maintain their Greekness. So you can really be a citizen of both worlds when you're living in Corinth. So that's a little bit of a background to who the people were. The significance of that we're going to talk about in the coming videos as to how those two worlds kind of work together and what they tended to cancel out. That becomes very important when we come to understand who the Corinthians were. But for the moment, we're going to finish this video and we're going to come back in the next one shortly. Welcome back. So we've talked a lot about what it means to be a Corinthian. So how does that all play out? Well, it happens here when Paul first arrives in Corinth. So what we're going to do for this in the next video is just to go through the story in Acts where we find Paul arriving at Corinth and what his early ministry there in Corinth looked like. And what's interesting is you start to see some of these other elements that we've talked about emerging now in some of the, particularly in the conflicts that we find Paul facing. So Paul came to Corinth during his second missionary journey. So if you're looking at the map there, it's the yellow line. You can pull up 100 of these different maps for Paul's missionary journeys. Just turn to the back of your Bible. You're going to find one. But anyway, it came on during his second missionary journey. And he arrived there probably around the year 49. If we pick up the story from Acts chapter 18, verse 2, it says that he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. So when Paul first arrived in Corinth, there was already a couple of Christians there, Priscilla and Aquila, who'd only just arrived there themselves. Now, in 49, we know that Claudius had expelled all the Jews from Rome, and so some of them, as it turns out, have turned up in Corinth. And so what it meant was that when Paul first arrived, there were at least a couple of Christians. So he wasn't the first Christian in the city, but certainly there was no established Christian community there. So he met with them because they were of the same trade as he is, as we see in a moment, which interestingly, we just got to make this point. We always think of Paul as being a tent maker. What he was a leather worker. One of the things that he built or made was tents, because tents were made from leather. But he could work with all sorts of leather products, horse saddles, shoes, you name it. He could do it. So he was a leather worker, the same way that Priscilla and Aquila were. And so it was very natural for him to go and meet with them because they're Christians, they're Jewish, and they share the same trade. It's perfect. It means that Paul can go and automatically have a connection with those people, and more importantly, he could then go and work with them. So Paul arrived 49, probably into 50 CE, and he began to work with them in their same trade. Now, the idea of the trade is really good for Paul, because it means that he's not reliant on people to pay his way. Now, the truth is that if you're a teacher or a minister in the Christian community or in any sort of teaching context, it would be expected that you would be paid by your students. That's just the normal practice. But it also, with that came certain obligations. If I pay you, then I own you. Or you are obligated to me. Or if I don't like what you're doing, I'll just stop paying you. Now, that doesn't really work for Paul, because he's got things to say that nobody wants to hear. Or he's going to do things, or he's going to want to do things his way. And so if he can free himself from that ability to be owned by somebody else, then he's obviously going to do that. Now, of course, it meant that he had to work through the day and he couldn't go and preach full time. But being able to be financially independent meant that he could do ministry his way. So this was very important for Paul. And what it also meant was that he was out there in the forum, working out there in the marketplace, and he was meeting all these people coming through. Because if, people coming off the boats every day, coming over to get things fixed, he was meeting new people every day. And having shared that message with them, knowing that, in a week's time they're going to go off to whatever port they're going off to, not only can he share the message with them, but they could then take the message out wherever he went. So it's a very practical job for him. As far as a trade's concerned, it's a lot easier than being a metal worker. I mean, could you imagine traveling around? I'm a traveling blacksmith. I got my anvil and all my hammers and all. It's just not going to happen. If you're a leather worker, you need some thread, you need some needles, you need a very small kit. It's a very mobile trade to have. So it's perfect for Paul. It's the ideal sort of trade for him to take with him. It says in verse 4 that he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. This is Paul's MO. This is the way that Paul does things. He turns up to a city, the first place he goes is the synagogue. Why the synagogue? Because there's Jews there. Why are they going to listen to him? Because he's a Pharisee. He's still Saul of Tarsus. He's still a Pharisee. And if he walks into a synagogue on a Saturday, he can be assured that he can get a pulpit, because he's a very famous Pharisee. And so he has an opportunity every week to go into the synagogue and to preach the gospel. But more than that, it means that he has a community. Remember I said to you in the very first video, it wasn't about who you are, it's about to whom you belong. And so Paul, being a Jew, and particularly being a rabbi, automatically has not just a community, but status within that community. And so he walks into a synagogue, even if he's never met those people in his life, which he obviously hasn't, they would automatically recognize, one, he's a Jew, and two, he's an important Jew. and so they're going to look after him. So that's very convenient for Paul. He can go into a synagogue, he can have a community the minute that he walks into any city. Until, of course, he starts talking about Jesus, and then they inevitably kick him out. But, at least he had a good place to start. The picture you've got here, this is from a 2nd century synagogue that they found. They found the parts of it in Corinth. So you've got the menorah on the one side, and on the other side you've got what's written in the Greek, the synagogue of the Hebrews. So there's the synagogue of the Hebrews. That's not the one that Paul was in. This is probably a 2nd century one, but certainly there was a synagogue there when Paul was there. Verse 5, it says, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus Christ, that the Christ was Jesus. We're going to talk a lot more about this event because this is really significant in the context of the Corinthian correspondence. But what happens is that Paul has arrived in Corinth. Now, if you remember in the story of Acts, Paul had been in Thessalonica, he'd been in Philippi, Thessalonica, and then he'd come down to Corinth. Now, in Thessalonica, there'd been a lot of persecution, and to the extent that they actually had to get Paul out of the city. So he comes out of the city, goes to Athens for a little while, and then he ends up in Corinth. But Timothy and Silas, who are his apprentices, are still there in Thessalonica. Now, they arrive in Corinth, and all of a sudden, Paul doesn't have to work anymore. All of a sudden, Paul can preach full-time and be supported. How did that happen? Well, because the Macedonians had actually taken up an offering to give to Paul to enable him to preach full-time. Now, I just said a moment ago that that's kind of not the way that Paul worked, or not that he wanted to work in some situations, Corinth in particular. So we'll unpack that a lot as the videos go on. But very importantly, this meant that Paul could now go full-time in his preaching. And that's a significant shift that happens as his ministry continues. Verse 6, and when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Isn't it interesting? I love the way Luke's so blunt about this. It's not a case of, and then in a shock moment, the Jews didn't like what Paul said. It's like, no, when it happened, because inevitably it's going to happen, they started to go all crazy about his preaching, and so he just said, well, to hell with all of yous, I'm going somewhere else. And he left there, and he went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshipper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. This is beautiful. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. All right, just digress for a moment. One of the codes of conduct in the Australian Christian churches is that if you leave a church with the intention of planting another church, you don't plant a church in the same city, because it's going to cause all sorts of troubles, etc., etc. And if it's been a particularly bad falling out, you need to give it 12 months. If you want to stay in the area, give it 12 months before you start a new church. Paul doesn't have any qualms about that rule. Paul just doesn't care about that stuff. He's kicked out of the synagogue. He literally goes to the house of the person next door, right? So you imagine this, right? You've left your church and you go, I'm going to go and start a church in that house right there. Anyone want to join me next Sunday? Not only that, he takes the synagogue rule. So he hasn't just gone and planted another church in the house next door. He's also taken the pastor and then just said, to hell with you guys, we're going to do our thing over here. Anyone want to join us? We'll be here every Saturday. Not a good ethic to practice if you're in ministry. Just saying that. So, imitate Paul on most things, but probably not at this point. It's going to get you in a lot of trouble. Just some free advice there. What's interesting though, Crispus, this synagogue ruler, to be the synagogue ruler, you've got to have a lot of wealth, because you're elected for that year to be the synagogue ruler, and you are in charge of the whole synagogue. That means that you have to pay for the running of the synagogue. Any oil that's required, or any upkeep of the synagogue, any feasts, all of that comes out of your pocket. Now, you get the honor of being the head of the synagogue, but it comes at a cost. What's really interesting in Corinth, and again, we're going to unpack this more as the videos go on, is that you find in Corinth, more than any other church of Paul's, you find some very wealthy people. In fact, some exceptionally wealthy people. For instance, we meet Chloe, 1 Corinthians 1:11, who was able to supply provisions to go to Ephesus. So when Paul gets a report from the Corinthians to say that all this is going on, it's from Chloe's household. So she's got enough slaves to be able to release some of them to go to Ephesus, to pay for their travel, to bring a message over to Paul. That's a woman of some significant means. Stephanus, same thing. He sends a report to Paul as well. Obviously has a big enough household for some of the Christians there in Corinth to be able to meet in. Gaius is a particularly important one. We actually meet him a couple of times. 1 Corinthians 16, who had a household, but also in Romans 16:23. Paul wrote Romans from Corinth, specifically from the house of Gaius. Now, if you did Romans with me, you would have seen more discussion there. We'll come back to it later. Gaius had a house big enough to accommodate the entire church. Now, think about that for a moment. Even if it's a small church of maybe 100 people, let me ask you this. Can you fit 100 people comfortably in your lounge room? If you can, you have a lot of money because your house is obviously a mansion. So Gaius obviously had some significant wealth. Crispus, as we saw earlier, he was the ruler of the synagogue. Again, a guy with some serious coin. And then Erastus, who's only briefly mentioned in Romans 16:23. Just very briefly mentioned in the greetings from Corinth. Now, Erastus, it says there, was the city treasurer. Interestingly, archaeologists have found this inscription that you see here, and it has there the name Erastus, and then a number of letters which basically stand for, in return for his being elected to the aedile, or to the city treasurer, laid this pavement. What's happened was that this particular Erastus of this particular pavement has come to the position of aedile, which is the second most powerful position in the city. He's put himself up for election, and he said, if you elect me, I'm going to build a road leading up to the theatre. He's been elected, he's fulfilled his campaign promise, and he's built this road, and so therefore this inscription has been laid there. Now, if this is the same Erastus, which some scholars believe it is, as Paul mentions in Romans 16, this is a very, very wealthy and significant person in the Christian community there at Corinth. Now, what has this got to do with anything? Well, with wealth comes power. With power comes influence. And with influence, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So as we read through Corinthians, what we're going to see are a whole lot of issues that all stem back to the behavior of a couple of very wealthy, very elite people within that Christian community. Possibly some of the people that are listed here right now. Very quickly, verse 9, and the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in the city who are my people. And he stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God amongst them. So he was there for 18 months, and during that 18 months, Jesus Christ himself actually had to come and appear to Paul and say, Paul, it's going to be okay. So Corinth, well, it was like a lot of big cities at the time, and quite clearly there must have been some pretty scary stuff going on, because for Jesus himself to actually have to turn up and say, Paul, it's going to be okay, there was obviously some serious reassurance that needed to happen for Paul at that particular time. So what were those things? Well, as the rest of this course unfolds, we'll start to see some of that, but enough for now. Let's come back in the next video. Hey there and welcome back. So, if you read Corinthians compared to, say, Philippians or Thessalonians, if you're paying attention, one of the things that you'll notice is that the letters to Philippians or to the Thessalonians, Paul's very reassuring to them. He speaks to them in very positive terms. He's very encouraging. And one of the concerns that they're facing is a lot of persecution. Particularly in Thessalonica, they're facing some significant persecution in both of the Thessalonian letters, and really that's driving a lot of the other things that are going on in that particular space. But when you read Corinthians, there's almost zero talk of persecution, almost none. It's like they're two completely polar opposite Christian communities, and there's a very good reason for that. In Thessalonica and in Philippi as well, which are both major cities in Macedonia, they were facing some significant persecution. But in Corinth, there's no persecution, and a lot of this actually stems back to the religious, quote-unquote, culture or religious, the word I'm looking for, the religious tone of the particular city. If you remember a couple of videos ago, we're saying that when we look at a typical Corinthian, it's kind of a combination both of a Greek and of a Roman. You've got very bilingual people, and you've got a city structure that is still predominantly Roman, but because it was a new colony, you need to get elites from wherever you can get them. Now, ideally, if you're building a Roman colony, you're going to have Roman elites running the show. They're the ones that are involved in the political processes. But if you don't have that, if you've got a brand new colony and you don't have enough legitimate Romans doing that, you're going to be taking elites from wherever you can find them. And that's exactly what happens in Corinth. What you find in the early city, or in the early colony, are a lot of local Greeks from the surrounding cities who aren't getting opportunities, particularly from Athens or Sparta or these surrounding cities. They're not getting the same opportunities in those bigger cities because the privileged positions are going to the established families and to the already established aristocracy of those places. So now they've got some money, they want to make a name for themselves, they want to get into important positions. Corinth is the best place to go, because you've got a brand new city that's looking for people to come and invest into it. Because with an elite person comes lots of money, comes lots of investment. People are building the city to gain honor for themselves. That's all to the advantage of the city. So Corinth, from its earliest time, has a mixture of both Roman elites, Roman government people, politicians, as well as Greek. Now, in a typically Roman or a traditionally Greek city, you have already established culture, established traditions. The gods of that city have been the gods time immemorial. Before people were even there, the gods of those cities were there beforehand. And so you've got these long-established cultures. Corinth is a brand new city. It's got brand new people who are of a sort of multi-identity, and all of its traditions really have been destroyed by the Romans because it had been desolate for 100 years. There had been a significant cut-off from the older Greek Corinth to the new Roman Corinth. So in every way, it's starting from scratch. What that means is that when gods are coming into the city, when new religions are being brought into the city, they're going to be accepted because we don't have... You can't say, well, we've never worshipped that one here before, so we can't have it now. There is none of that. There is no culture. There is no tradition. So when you get this type of environment, and amongst the elites, amongst the political powers who make the decision as to who gets to come in and who we kick out, there's a lot more ambiguity. You've got lots of different guys coming in. You've got both Roman and Greek magistrates who are making the decision as to which are the cults or the religions we're going to accept. When you've got all of these different ideas happening at the same time, it's easier just to be a bit more ambiguous about it. There's no fixed culture, there's no fixed tradition. And so in cultic terms, in terms of religion, it's much more fluid. It's much more adaptable to any new ideas that might be coming in because they're much more about business, they're much more about markets, it's much more about economic progress, as they are maybe so much about the various religious cults that are accepted in the city. What all that boils down to is this. When Paul came in and brought the Christian message, it's much easier for Paul not necessarily to get a foothold in the city, but to fly under the radar. You go into Jerusalem, you preach Christianity, you're going to get persecuted. It's the same in Rome, same in any of these major cities, you're going to get persecuted. Or there's going to be a lot more suspicion because you're perceived to be upending our traditions and our heritage. In Corinth, they don't have any of that, so Christianity can come in and really fly under the radar. Now, what that means is, in a city where there's no persecution, it's much easier to be a Christian for any reason. Think about it in modern terms. Think about a country right now where you're persecuted for being a Christian, where you could potentially be killed for being a Christian. You're going to have to be very serious about whether or not you want to be a Christian. Because if you're just mucking around with it, at the risk of death, you're kind of stupid. You're either going to fully believe in it or you're going to have nothing to do with it. Unlike a Western country like Australia, where you don't face persecution for being a Christian, I mean, someone might call you stupid. Who cares? You're not going to be killed for it. And so you find in countries like that, or in cultures like that, much more of a fluidity, much more of a variation in the reasons or the seriousness with which you take your Christianity. And I think that's precisely what we see in our churches. We see people who are Christians for any and every reason, and there's much more of a tolerance to all sorts of different behaviours because in a lot of cases, people are just, Christianity is something much more pragmatic. Unlike in places where you've got to go underground to be a Christian, you're going to have a lot more shared values. You're going to be much more passionate about your faith. And so when we compare Thessalonica with Corinth, you sort of see those two different worlds. Thessalonica persecuted and much more passionate about their faith, whereas within Corinth, a city that's much more fluid about its religious ideas, you can become a Christian for any and every reason. And really, that underlies so many of the issues that we're facing or that we deal with in this Corinthian community. And so there's a lack of early tension in the church. Most of them are just Corinthians being Corinthians. They're coming in and they've got this very ambiguous idea about the gods, and Christianity is just one of many. And so when they come, they're just Corinthians being Corinthians. But really, this is one of the unique characteristics of the city of Corinth, as opposed to, say, Rome, Philippi, Jerusalem, etc. What this leads to, and that's just, this is maybe a slightly longer video, but just if you just follow with me. The turning point for Paul in Corinth was a confrontation that he had with the governor of the city, who was actually the governor of the entire region of Achaia, a guy by the name of Gallio. And we read about it here in Acts 18:12. It says, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. So what's happened is that Paul's obviously already offended the Jews. We saw that earlier on. He was kicked out of the synagogue. They never really liked Paul to begin with. But now there's a problem. Not just that Paul is still preaching Christianity, but he's having some success in his preaching of Christianity. People are starting to come over to this faith. And they don't want this. Of course they don't want this, because at the very least, they saw Jesus as being, well, a heretic or as being a blasphemy against God. And so they wanted to eradicate this. But there was a deeper social issue that was taking place here. I talked about these groups. If you can be part of any number of different groups within the ancient world. And one of the problems that the empire has with these groups is that there's a lot of suspicion about them. Think about, in a tyrannical sort of nation where there's any people that are getting together in a group regularly could be seen to be maybe subversive, could be seen to be overthrowing the ruling powers. For Rome, it was no different. If you were part of a regular group, there was going to be some suspicion about you, to the extent that a lot of these groups were actually shut down, except for the Jews. Because the Jews have always been meeting every Saturday in synagogues long before the Romans had ever had anything to do with the Eastern Empire. They've always been there. And so Jews have always just been part of the fabric. The Romans knew very well that the Jews aren't getting together to plot an insurrection. They're not going to overthrow the empire. And so the Jews have an exception. They've got an exemption from this rule that says that you can't meet. The Jews are in fact allowed to meet. Now that's really convenient for the Christians, because as far as the Romans are concerned, Christians are just another type of Judaism. Now, Jews would argue and say, no, they're not part of us, but the Romans are like, who cares? It's a bit like today, somebody coming up to you and saying, oh, you're like the Mormons and the JWs and the Christian Scientists. You go, no, they're heretics, they're whatever they are, right? They're not like us. And they're like, we don't care. You all talk about Jesus, you all go to church, it's all the same thing to us. So for the Christians, they could fly under the radar under the guise of being a form of Judaism, which really they were. So that's convenient for Paul. But now in Corinth, you've got the Jewish community saying, we want to deal with this thing once for all. And so they bring Paul before Gallio. Now, Gallio is personally appointed by the emperor to be the governor of that region. He is the only person in that whole area that has the power of life and death. He could kill Paul on the spot, and that's perfectly within his rights to do that. And the Jews know this. So to deal with Paul, what they say, they bring him before Gallio and they say he's encouraging people to worship God contrary to the law. Which law? Not Jewish law, because Romans don't care about Jewish law. Contrary to Roman law. That is, they're meeting every week, even though you have said people aren't allowed to meet on a regular basis. Gallio's response is fascinating. He says this: if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, who's the new ruler of the synagogue, because Paul took Crispus, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to it. By the way, these pictures that I'm showing you along the side of it is actually the where this took place. This is the seat of judgment in the Forum of Corinth. So this is exactly where Paul would have stood when all of these events were happening. Let me just finish on this point. This is what is really quite significant about the Christian community in Corinth. Gallio's decision at that point to say, I don't care, became a legal ruling. That is, what the Jews had done is try to bring Paul before the tribunal and say, this guy is breaking the law by meeting with his Christians on a weekly basis. By Gallio saying, I don't care, is the same as saying, as far as I'm concerned, he's just another one of you guys. More importantly, this is a legal religious group. Unlike many other cities where you can be persecuted for being a Christian, in Corinth, you could be a Christian without any fear of repercussion from the authorities or from the people around you, because it was just very religiously fluid. Now again, come back to your Australian context or to your Western context, where there's no persecution, where there's no fear of being challenged by being a Christian. What can that produce? Well, very simply, complacency. Being a Christian for any reason other than to fully die to Christ and to fully live for him. And again, this is precisely what we find when we look at the Corinthian Christian community. Christians who are just being Corinthians, and in some cases come into the Christian church for any reasons other than to worship Jesus Christ. But again, we'll play this out as the videos carry on. One more to go for this session, and then we'll be able to move on. See you soon. Hi there, welcome to the final video for this topic. So if you remember in the last one, we finished with a point of tension. Paul has been brought before Gallio, Gallio, the governor of the region, the only person in the area that's got the power of life and death. The Jews had brought him before that. We saw that basically he dismissed it and at the same time effectively declared that Christianity was legal within the region of Corinth. Now, that's a win for the Corinthians in some senses, but for Paul, it's made him realize that, you know what, it's probably, I've been here for long enough. If the Jews, they've failed in that attempt, but he knows that they're going to keep coming for him. So he decides it's time to go. He's been there for 18 months, a lot of good things have happened, but now it's time to move on. And so as the story continues on, Paul goes over now to Ephesus. And if you can follow the story through Acts 18 and 19 if you want to read on yourself. Paul goes over to Ephesus with the intention of then heading down to Jerusalem, which is what he does. And really what this has become is the end of his second missionary journey. So the last really significant thing that he does on this second journey is Corinth. That's where that Christian community is established. He goes over now with Priscilla and Aquila to Ephesus. They've obviously become very good friends by this stage, and we know that they've become major supporters of Paul's ministry because he keeps referring to them all the way through his letters. He heads off to Jerusalem. But then the question remains, what's happening in Corinth? Now, Paul's standard practice is to preach in a city, establish a community, and then leave some teachers behind. Now, Timothy was that person. Timothy seems to have been the go-between between Paul and the Corinthians, at least for a while. But Timothy's only one person, and there's plenty more going on, and there's probably other Corinthians that Paul has raised up to be teachers as well, and he sort of alludes to them through 1 Corinthians. So there are some teachers that are teaching in there, and Timothy is kind of Paul's guy. Timothy is at least a connection between Paul's values and this church that he's just established. But very soon, we actually meet another teacher that comes into the Corinthian congregation. And this is the last sort of important factor that helps us to understand 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians as the rest of these letters unfold. We pick the story up in Acts 18:24. It says, "Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent..." Now, this is after Paul's left Ephesus. He's gone to Jerusalem. Apollos now comes from Alexandria up to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him. Now, whenever you see Achaia mentioned in the New Testament, it's talking about Corinth. Corinth was the capital of Achaia. And so when it's talking about Macedonia, it's probably referring to Philippi or Thessalonica, because those are the key cities that Paul had established communities. So when he says Achaia, he's going to Corinth. The brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that Christ was Jesus. So who's this Apollos? Well, we get a couple of very important clues from this passage. Firstly, he came from Alexandria. What's significant about Alexandria? Well, there were three major educational cities in the ancient world. There was Athens, there was Tarsus, if you remember that's where Paul came from, and there was Alexandria. What Alexandria was most known for was its training in oratory. The best orators were produced in Alexandria. So Apollos, from Alexandria, has been trained in oratory, because it says, next line, he was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. So he's a Jew, clearly. He's educated, so he has to be elite. There's some money in his family for him to get that sort of education. So he's a man of wealth, he's a man of eloquence because he's been trained in Alexandria, so he's not just an orator, he's a very good orator. He's a great orator. In fact, he's like the T.D. Jakes of the ancient world type orator. So he's wealthy, he's elite, he's educated, he's trained in scriptures, he's Jewish, and now he knows Jesus. Or at least he knows the full gospel message. He now goes over to Corinth. Now, think about this. As we see later on, Paul's preaching in Corinth wasn't that good. This initial community that had been formed there had been formed under Paul's preaching, which, by his own confession, wasn't that great. Certainly wasn't that articulate. Now, all of a sudden, they've got this guy, Apollos, who's come over, who's been endorsed by Priscilla and Aquila, who they knew are associated with Paul. So if they've endorsed him, then obviously Paul's endorsed him as well. So he must be somebody very important to those guys. But more importantly, this guy can really preach. And he's pretty smart too. It's not just that he's got a lot of knowledge about scriptures. He's got this sort of Alexandrian wisdom about him, this ability to explain things in deeper ways, this incredible ability to articulate ideas in such a way that if you understand it, you must be really smart type person. You know, you sit through those sermons and you're like, I don't know what you're saying, but I still feel smarter just for sitting in the room. That kind of guy. Whereas Paul had been kind of poorly presented, only gave him milk, not really much to say about his ministry. So a couple of things are happening here. First of all, now suddenly these Corinthians have got this orator that is just extraordinary. Now, if you remember, drawing all the dots together here, one of the key things that is significant of Corinth is they have the Isthmian Games, right? So this is a biannual event, one of the most important festivals of the ancient world. And one of the key events of the Isthmian Games is oratory. So every 2 years, the Corinthians have the world's best orators come into town. Every 2 years. And so they have gotten used to the best of the best. Paul hasn't been very good, but now all of a sudden, you've got a guy by the name of Apollos who could probably compete well in the Isthmian Games. I mean, this guy is just awesome. So a whole lot of the Corinthians are going to go, you know what, he's our man. Not just for the fact that Paul's no longer here, but we've got a guy who is kind of up to our standards of oratory. The other thing that's going to happen is that Apollos is going to continue on the ministry, and there are going to be a whole lot of people now who are becoming Christians who've never heard of Paul. They might have seen him when Paul was around the city, but they certainly weren't part of the community. So now you've got two groups of people coming into one. You've got the people, the original Corinthians, who have fallen in love with Apollos, and new converts who have come under the ministry of Apollos. Very quickly, we start to get divisions happening. I follow Paul. I follow Apollos. And that's precisely what we see play out as the story continues. But let me finish up very quickly. So, 53, Paul gets a letter from the Corinthians, some sort of message from the Corinthians, to which he responds with a formal letter. We don't know what this letter is. There's lots of different theories about it, but the fact is we just don't know what this letter was. Technically, that was actually 1 Corinthians. That was at least the first response that Paul writes, dealing with sexual immorality. And he alludes to this letter very briefly in 1 Corinthians 5-9, which we'll come to later. Then he responds to that, but then later on, in probably about 54, Paul receives two correspondences, and they're quite concerning. The first one is a verbal report, which there's a whole lot of issues going on, and the second one is a written report, which has a whole lot of other issues that are going on. And so what Paul does in response to that, well, we can look at probably some of the issues here, just listed here. There's firstly this confusion about Paul's instructions in the previous letter. Paul needs to say to them again what he meant the first time. Divisions that are running between the separate house churches, and we'll come back to the discussion of that in a moment, or later on. Some of the wealthier members of the church are still struggling to separate themselves from their previous lives, and that's resulting in divisions at the Lord's Supper, arrogance in worship, eating meat at idols' temples, and the like. In other words, the Corinthians are just doing what the Corinthians have always done. And that's really how we need to understand everything that goes on from here. Paul had initially refused patronage, support from the Corinthians. Instead, he'd made tents. That's going to become an issue that comes to a head that we'll discuss later on. But the most important issue that Paul needs to deal with first is division over leadership. In fact, the very first thing that Paul addresses is going to set up the context for the rest of 1 Corinthians. That is, some of the Corinthians aren't even going to listen to Paul anymore. Even though he founded the congregation there, they're saying, you know what, we're done with Paul. Apollos is our man. Now, that's really problematic. If you're going to deal with all of these other issues, you first of all have to make sure that everybody in the room is going to listen to you. And so it's to that Paul writes our 1 Corinthians. It's effectively the second letter of the correspondence, but it's certainly the most urgent. It's the most pressing to this point. And as you see from the 16 chapters of it, there's a lot of things that Paul needs to re-explain, clear up, or just frankly tell them to stop. But anyway, we're going to come back to that as the class goes on. So I'll see you in the next video.